Rain lashed against the London sidewalk as Elena stood before the most dangerous man in the city. With no home and nowhere to run, she made a desperate plea to Julian. "If you let me stay, I can clean and cook," she whispered, unaware that entering his world meant stepping into a gilded cage of secrets and shadows. Their arrangement was supposed to be simple, until one night of shared vulnerability changed everything. Now, caught between his dark empire and an intense, undeniable passion, Elena must decide if the safety of his arms is worth the deadly price of his love. The rain in São Paulo did not just fall. It rhythmic and relentless, a heavy curtain of grey water that threatened to drown the world. On a Tuesday in October of last year, the city felt less like a metropolitan hub and more like a concrete basin filling with the tears of millions. The streets of the Jardins district, usually manicured and prestigious, were slick with oil and debris. Helena stood in the shadow of a bus stop, her threadbare backpack feeling like 100 pounds of wet lead against her aching shoulders. She was 24 years old, and for the last 3 months she had been a shadow moving through a city that preferred its ghosts to remain invisible. Her sneakers were soaked through, the fabric squelching with every shivering step. Hunger was no longer a sharp pain. It had become a dull, vibrating hum in her bones. She looked up at the towering apartment complex across the street, a monolith of glass and steel that reached toward the angry clouds. It was a fortress for the fortunate, a place where the air was filtered and the water was always warm. Helena didn't want their jewelry or their fine wine. She just wanted to stop shaking. Fortune, or perhaps a moment of divine negligence, favored her. A delivery motorcycle skidded to a halt near the service entrance, and the driver, cursing the deluge, fumbled with his intercom. In the chaos of the wind and the blinding spray, Helena slipped past the closing gate. She moved with the practiced silence of a stray cat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She bypassed the main lobby, finding the service elevator. She pressed a button for one of the highest floors, her finger trembling as she touched the cold plastic. When the doors slid open, she found herself in a small, dimly lit vestibule. To her left was a heavy steel door, slightly ajar, leading into a kitchen that smelled of expensive spices and something metallic, like iron. Helena stepped inside, her breath hitching. The room was a masterpiece of dark marble and brushed copper. It was warm, so incredibly warm. She stood there for a moment, the water from her hair dripping onto the pristine floor, forming a dark puddle that felt like a desecration. She moved toward the counter, her eyes landing on a loaf of crusty bread. Her hand reached out, her fingers twitching with a desperate, animalistic need. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was low, laced with a thick, melodic accent that sounded like the fog of London. Helena froze. Her blood turned to ice, and a different kind of shivering took hold of her. She slowly turned her head. Standing in the archway that led to the living area was a man. He was 38, though the hard lines around his eyes suggested a life that had lasted much longer. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with faded scars. His hair was dark, contrasting sharply with eyes that were the color of a winter sea, cold, steel blue, and utterly devoid of mercy. In his right hand, he held a black pistol. It was fitted with a long cylindrical silencer. He didn't point it at her chest. He pointed it directly between her eyes. Helena didn't scream. She didn't drop to her knees. The months of sleeping on cardboard and dodging the predatory eyes of the city's underbelly had burned the fear out of her, replacing it with a hollow, crystalline clarity. She looked at the barrel of the gun, then up at the man's face. "You're soaking wet," the man said, his voice a calm, terrifying rasp. "And you're bleeding on my floor." Helena looked down. She hadn't realized she'd cut her hand on a piece of wire while climbing a fence earlier that evening. A thin trail of crimson was mixing with the rainwater on the marble. She looked back at him, her voice surprisingly steady. "I didn't come to steal anything," she whispered. "I just wanted to be dry. Just for 1 hour." "An hour is a long time in my world," he replied. He stepped closer, the light from the pendant lamps catching the sharp angle of his jaw. He moved with a predatory grace, a man who was clearly used to being the most dangerous thing in any room. Who sent you? Was it the Russians? Or the boys from the north? No one sent me, Helena said, her eyes narrowing. I don't even know who you are. I'm no one. The man, whose name was Arthur, studied her. He looked at her tattered clothes, the way her collarbone protruded, and the fierce, defiant spark in her gaze. He had spent his life surrounded by men who would beg for their lives, but this girl looked as if she was simply waiting for the inevitable. He lowered the gun slightly, though his finger remained firm on the trigger. You have 10 seconds to give me a reason not to put you in the trash chute, Arthur said. Helena took a step forward, ignoring the weapon. The warmth of the apartment was beginning to seep into her skin, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of possessiveness for this sanctuary. She looked around the kitchen, the copper pots, the smudge of flour on the counter, the half-finished bottle of wine. If you let me stay, she started, her voice growing stronger, I can clean and cook. I've seen the way you live. There's dust on the baseboards, and you're eating store-bought bread. I can make this place look like no one lives here. I'll be a ghost. You won't hear me, you won't see me, but you'll come home to a house that feels like a home. Arthur let out a short, dry laugh. A maid? You think I need a maid? You need someone who doesn't ask questions, Helena countered, her heart racing. I've lived on the streets for 3 months. I know how to disappear. I know how to keep secrets because my life depends on it. You're hiding too. I can see it in the way you hold that gun. We're the same. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the muffled roar of the rain against the reinforced glass windows. Arthur's gaze traveled over her again, lingering on the curve of her neck and the way her damp shirt clung to her frame. There was a raw, primal energy between them, a tension that wasn't just about the threat of death. It was the friction of two broken things recognizing each other in the dark. Arthur stepped so close that she could smell the scent of expensive tobacco and sandalwood clinging to his skin. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers grazing the side of her jaw. His touch was unexpectedly hot against her cold skin, a jolt of electricity that made her breath hitch. He tilted her head back, forcing her to look into the depths of those steel-blue eyes. "What's your name, girl?" "Helena," she breathed. "Helena," he repeated, the name sounding like a prayer and a curse in his London accent. He slowly lowered the pistol and tucked it into the small of his back. "There's a bathroom through that door. Wash the street off you. There are clothes in the 3rd drawer of the dressing room. They belong to someone who doesn't need them anymore." Helena felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "Does this mean I stay?" Arthur turned his back to her, walking toward the window that overlooked the drowning city. The lights of São Paulo blurred into a sea of neon gold and red. "It means if I find a single speck of dust tomorrow morning, or if you touch anything you shouldn't, I'll find out how well ghosts can swim in the Tietê River." Helena watched him for a moment, her chest heaving with relief and a new, more complicated kind of fear. She had found a roof, a sanctuary from the storm, but she had entered a different kind of tempest. As she walked toward the bathroom, she noticed a small, leather-bound notebook on the side table, its pages filled with names and numbers that meant nothing to her yet. She closed the door behind her and stripped off her wet, ruined clothes. The shower was a miracle of scalding water and expensive soap. As she scrubbed the grime of the city from her skin, she thought about the man in the living room. He was a predator, a man who dealt in shadows and lead. But as she wrapped herself in a plush, oversized robe, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving, she was playing a game. When she emerged, the apartment was silent. Arthur was gone from the main room, but the scent of his cologne lingered like a ghost. Helena walked into the kitchen and began to work. She moved with a silent, feverish intensity, scrubbing the marble until it gleamed, organizing the pantry, and preparing a simple, elegant meal with the ingredients she found. She was finishing the task when she saw it, a small, dark stain on a silk shirt draped over the back of a chair near the laundry area. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the fabric. It wasn't wine. It was a dried splash of blood, positioned right over where a man's heart would beat. Helena's grip tightened on the silk. She had promised to be a ghost, but as she looked at the evidence of Arthur's violent world, She realized that in this house, the ghosts were the only ones who truly knew the truth. She began to scrub the stain, her movements rhythmic and focused, unaware that from a hidden camera in the corner of the ceiling, Arthur was watching her every move, his finger hovering over a different kind of trigger. The rain over São Paulo did not cease with the passing of Tuesday. It lingered for the remainder of that week in October of last year, a relentless grey curtain that blurred the sharp edges of the skyscrapers in the Jardins district. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of pressure. Helena moved through the expansive, minimalist rooms like a spectre of industry. She had promised to be a ghost, and she took that vow with a desperation that bordered on the religious. Arthur was a man of routines, though they were the routines of a predator. He spent his mornings in the glass-walled study, 3 different burner phones lined up on his mahogany desk like soldiers. One was for the local connections in the city's complex underworld, one was for the logistics at the port of Santos, and the third, a sleek black device he rarely touched, was his only remaining link to the grey, rain-slicked streets of London he had fled. Helena watched him from the periphery, her eyes capturing every detail while her hands remained busy. She began her days by scrubbing the marble floors of the kitchen. The stone was cold, a stark contrast to the humid heat of the city, pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She used a mixture of vinegar and lemon, a trick she had learned when her family still had a home and a future, before her father's debts turned their lives into a series of frantic escapes. She found a strange meditative peace in the labor. As she polished the surfaces until they reflected the flickering lights of the city below, she felt she was also scrubbing away the grime of the streets that had clung to her skin for months. Arthur's presence was a heavy weight in the apartment. He didn't speak to her much during those first 6 days. He watched her, however. Through the integrated security system that fed live footage to the monitors in his bedroom and study, he observed the way she moved. He expected her to steal, to snoop, or to break under the silent tension he projected. Instead, he saw a woman who handled his expensive crystal with the gentleness of a mother and his laundry with the precision of a tailor. On Thursday, she found the first sign of the world he truly inhabited. While sorting through a pile of discarded clothes in the laundry room, she pulled out a white silk shirt. It was a beautiful piece, likely costing more than she had earned in a year of odd jobs. Near the cuff of the left sleeve, there was a jagged, dark spray of dried blood. It wasn't a smudge, it was a violent signature. Helena didn't flinch. She took the shirt to the sink, using cold water and a steady hand to work the stain out. She knew that in Arthur's world, blood was just another form of dirt that needed to be managed. Later that evening, the air in the penthouse shifted. The silence, which had been a barrier, began to feel like a bridge. Helena decided to prepare a meal that went beyond the simple sandwiches she had been making. She found a stash of imported Italian pasta, some fresh basil, and a jar of sun-dried tomatoes in the back of the pantry. As the scent of garlic and olive oil began to fill the kitchen, she heard the heavy thud of Arthur's boots on the hardwood. He appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the glowing lights of the city. He had discarded his jacket, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the corded muscles of his neck. His steel-blue eyes weren't as cold tonight. They were tired. "I didn't ask for dinner," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the small space of the kitchen. "You have to eat, Arthur," she replied softly, her back to him as she stirred the sauce. "A man who doesn't eat makes mistakes, and I think you're a man who can't afford mistakes." He walked closer, stopping just a few inches behind her. The heat radiating from his body was palpable, a physical force that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. He reached around her, his arm grazing hers, to pick up a piece of the fresh basil she had sliced. His touch was brief, a mere whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her that made her breath hitch. "You're very observant for a girl who's supposed to be a ghost," he murmured. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "What else have you noticed, Helena?" She turned to face him, the wooden spoon still in her hand. The proximity was dangerous, almost suffocating. Up close, she could see the faint scars on his jawline, and the way his eyes seemed to constantly scan for threats, even here, 40 stories above the ground. "I noticed the map of the port of Santos pinned to your wall," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And I noticed that the third phone hasn't rung once in 6 days. You're waiting for something, something you're afraid of." Arthur's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. For a moment the predatory edge returned and Helena feared she had pushed too far. He reached out, his large hand cupping her chin, forcing her to look up at him. His thumb brushed against her lower lip, a gesture that was both a threat and a caress. The intimacy of the movement was overwhelming. She could smell the faint scent of expensive tobacco and rain on him. "You're smarter than you look," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "In my world, that's usually a death sentence. People who see too much don't last long." "I've already been through my death sentence," she countered, her eyes locked onto his. "The streets took everything I had. You're the only thing keeping me from going back there. I'm not your enemy, Arthur." He stared at her for a long time, his thumb still tracing the line of her lip. The tension between them was no longer just about survival. It was a slow-burning fuse of attraction that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Finally, he let go, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. "The meal smells good," he said, his voice regaining its icy composure. "Bring it to the dining room when you're done." As Helena served him that night, she noticed the way his hands shook slightly when he reached for his wine glass. He was a man of immense power, but he was also a man on the edge of a precipice. She sat in the kitchen afterward, eating her own portion in the dark, watching the red and white lights of the traffic below. She realized then that she wasn't just a servant in this penthouse. She was a witness. She was becoming the keeper of his secrets, the one who cleaned the blood from his shirts, and the one who saw the cracks in his armor. It was a position of power, but also one of extreme vulnerability. The week ended with a heavy, oppressive heat that even the air conditioning couldn't fully mask. On Sunday, as the city prepared for another week of chaos, Helena found Arthur standing by the window, staring out toward the south, toward the sea. He held the black phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen. "They're coming," he said, without turning around. Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She didn't need to ask who they were. The shadows of London were long, and they had finally reached the shores of Brazil. As she moved to clear the table, she saw a drop of something dark on the floor near his feet. It wasn't wine. Arthur turned slightly, and she saw the way he leaned against the glass, his face pale under the moonlight. The silence of the penthouse was about to be shattered, and the ghost in the kitchen was about to become the only person he could trust with his life. She stepped toward him, her hand reaching out to steady him, but before her fingers could touch his arm, the main elevator chimed, a sound that, at this hour, could only mean one thing. Arthur's hand flew to the holster at the small of his back, and the look he gave her was one of pure, unadulterated warning. The peace of the golden cage had been an illusion, and the first crack was already spreading through the glass. The rain in São Paulo during November was unlike anything Helena had ever experienced. It wasn't the gentle, persistent drizzle of a London autumn that Arthur often described with a bitter nostalgia. It was a violent, equatorial deluge that turned the streets into rivers and the sky into a bruised purple canvas. From the 34th floor of the penthouse in Jardins, the city looked like a drowning galaxy of amber and white lights. Helena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection ghostly against the glass. She had been living there for several weeks now, a silent spirit inhabiting the periphery of a dangerous man's life. She had kept her promise. The floors were polished to a mirror shine. The scent of lavender and expensive wax replaced the stale smell of expensive cigars, and the kitchen was always stocked with meals that looked like art. She had learned to navigate the silence of the apartment, and more importantly, the silence of Arthur. He was a man of few words and many shadows, often disappearing for days, only to return with a coldness in his eyes that made the air in the room drop several degrees. It was late on a Friday, when the heavy mahogany door swung open with a muffled thud. Helena was in the kitchen, folding linen napkins with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. She froze. The sound of his footsteps was wrong. Usually Arthur moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Tonight, his stride was heavy, dragging, and uneven. She hurried into the foyer, her breath catching in her throat. Arthur was leaning against the marble console table, his face ashen, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the stone. His expensive charcoal suit jacket was draped over one arm, but it was his white silk shirt that drew her eye. A dark, visceral crimson stain was spreading across his left side, soaking through the fine fabric and dripping onto the light grey rug. "Arthur," she whispered, moving toward him instinctively. "Don't," he rasped, his voice a jagged edge of pain. "Just give me a minute." He tried to push himself upright, but his knees buckled. Helena caught him, her small frame straining under his dead weight. She was surprised by the heat radiating from him, a feverish, localized warmth that smelled of metallic blood and expensive cologne. She steered him toward the leather sofa in the living room, helping him lower his body onto the cushions. He let out a low, guttural groan that vibrated through her own chest. "I need to call a doctor," she said, her hands trembling as she reached for the phone on the side table. His hand shot out, surprisingly fast, despite his injury, and gripped her wrist. His fingers were cold, but his grip was like iron. "No doctors, no hospitals. I'm not supposed to be in this country, Helena. You know that. If I go to a clinic, the police get a report. If the police get a report, my location gets flagged, and if that happens, I'm dead before the sun comes up. You're bleeding through your shirt, Arthur. You're going to lose too much." "Then fix it," he said, his blue eyes boring into hers, desperate and demanding. "You lived on the streets for 2 years. You told me you saw things. You survived things. Fix me?" Helena felt a surge of adrenaline, the old survival instincts of her childhood and her years of homelessness kicking in. She had seen men stabbed in alleyways. She had watched her own father try to stitch a gash in his arm with a fishing line after a debt collector came knocking. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I need the first aid kit from your bathroom," she commanded, her voice steadying. "And I need the highest proof vodka in your bar now." She didn't wait for him to answer. She moved with a feverish intensity she hadn't felt in years. When she returned, she found him struggling to unbutton his shirt. His fingers were clumsy, shaking with the onset of shock. "Let me," she murmured. She knelt between his legs, her knees pressing into the soft carpet. With gentle but firm movements, she undid the buttons one by one. As the fabric fell away, the extent of the damage was revealed. A jagged, angry gash ran across his lower ribs, at least 5 inches long. It wasn't deep enough to hit an organ, but it was wide, the flesh weeping and raw. Helena poured the vodka over her hands first, the sting of the alcohol a sharp reminder of the reality of the situation. Then she looked up at him. "This is going to hurt, more than the cut did." Arthur leaned his head back against the sofa, his throat exposed, a hard line of muscle jumping in his jaw. "Just do it." She pressed a cloth soaked in the spirits against the wound. Arthur's body convulsed, a silent scream trapped behind his clenched teeth. His hand found her shoulder, his fingers digging into her flesh as he fought the agony. In that moment, the distance between them vanished. The master and the servant, the gangster and the ghost, they were just 2 bodies in a room, bound by the raw necessity of survival. As she worked, cleaning the debris from the wound with a steady hand, Helena became acutely aware of him. The rise and fall of his chest, the faint dusting of dark hair on his torso, the way his skin felt beneath her fingertips, supple and hot. She had to stitch the wound. She threaded the surgical needle with a focused intensity, her face only inches from his. She could feel his breath on her forehead, ragged and warm. "You're very good at this," he whispered, his voice drifting, the pain beginning to merge with the haze of blood loss. "I had to be," she replied, her eyes never leaving her work. "The streets don't give you many chances to be clumsy." As the needle pierced his skin, Arthur began to mutter. It started as a low hum, but soon words began to spill out, secrets he would never have uttered while conscious. He spoke of London, of a man named Julian, and of a betrayal that had cost him a brother he never mentioned. He spoke of the firm and the cold grey docks where he had made his first million and his first enemy. "They're coming, Helena," he murmured, his eyes half closed, glazed with a shimmering veil of delirium. "They don't stop. Once they smell the blood, they don't stop until the cage is empty." Helena's heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't just tending to a wound, she was listening to a death warrant. Every name he whispered was a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. She finished the final stitch, knotting the thread with a trembling hand, and applied a clean bandage. She stayed there, kneeling between his legs long after she was done, her hands resting lightly on his thighs. The tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer just the fear of his injury, it was a heavy, sensual pull that made her pulse thrum in her ears. Arthur's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face. The coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. He reached out, his thumb grazing her lower lip. It was a soft, tentative touch, a stark contrast to the violence of his world. Helena didn't pull away. She leaned into the contact, her eyes closing as a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold rain ran down her spine. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. "You could have run tonight. You could have taken my keys, my cash, and disappeared." "Because," Helena whispered, looking into those steel blue eyes that seemed to see right through her soul, "I'm tired of running, Arthur. And I think you are, too." He didn't answer. His hand moved from her lip to the back of her neck, pulling her slowly, agonizingly toward him. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and the anticipation was a physical ache in her chest. But his strength gave out, his hand dropping as he fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Helena sat on the floor, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. She looked at the blood on her hands and the ruined silk shirt on the floor. She realized then that her life as a ghost was over. She was no longer just cleaning his house, she was part of his history, part of his sins. As the sun began to hint at a grey dawn over the skyline of São Paulo, Helena noticed something she had missed before. On the console table where Arthur had first leaned, tucked under his discarded jacket, was a burner phone. It was vibrating silently. She picked it up. There was a single message on the screen, written in English, from a number with a London area code. "We found the bird in the southern nest. See you soon, Arthur." Helena felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. The secrets Arthur had spilled in his delirium weren't just ghosts of the past, they were the shadows of a very real, very lethal future that was already knocking on the door. The humidity of December in São Paulo was a heavy, tangible thing, a thick velvet curtain that draped over the city and refused to lift. Inside the penthouse in the Jardins district, the air conditioning hummed a low, constant note, keeping the tropical fever at bay. For Helena, the transition from the rain-slicked streets to this glass-walled sanctuary had been a blur of survival instincts. But as the final month of the year took hold, a new, more terrifying sensation began to settle in her chest. Comfort. Arthur's recovery from the wound in his ribs had been slow, marked by long afternoons of silence and the sharp, medicinal scent of the ointments Helena applied to his skin. She had become an expert at reading the micro-expressions on his face, the slight furrow of his brow when he moved too quickly, the tightening of his jaw when the pain spiked. He was no longer just the man with the silenced pistol. He was a body she had mended, a life she had, in some small way, claimed as her responsibility. By the second week of December, the dynamic of the household had shifted irrevocably. The kitchen, once a place where Helena worked in solitary, ghost-like efficiency, had become the heart of their strange, secluded world. Arthur began to emerge from his office not just for his meals, but to watch her. He would sit at the kitchen island, his tall, lean frame draped in a charcoal silk robe, his blue eyes tracking her every movement as she chopped cilantro or stirred a simmering pot of black beans and pork. "You cook like someone who hasn't always been hungry," Arthur remarked one evening. His voice was a low rumble, the accent of the London streets softened by years of exile, but still holding that dangerous, rhythmic edge. Helena paused, her knife hovering over a head of garlic. She didn't look up, but she felt the heat of his gaze on the back of her neck. "My mother taught me. She used to say that a good meal could make a person forget they were poor for at least an hour. She was right, for a while." Arthur stood up, moving with a fluid grace that suggested his strength was returning. He walked toward her, stopping just close enough for her to catch the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco that always clung to him. "And then the hour ended?" "The hour ended when my father's debts became larger than the house we lived in," she said, finally turning to face him. Her voice was steady, but her heart was thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't mean to lose everything. He just thought the next hand of cards would be the one to save us. He was a man who lived on almosts until the almosts ran out. Arthur reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers brushed against her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused from years of violence, yet his touch was incredibly light. "I grew up in a place where the sun never seemed to reach the ground," he whispered. "The East End. Everything was grey. The buildings, the sky, the people. I decided very early that I wouldn't be grey. I wanted the colour that money brings, even if that colour was blood red." The honesty in his voice was a physical weight. Helena didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned almost imperceptibly into his palm. The sensual tension that had been building between them for weeks suddenly flared into something sharp and undeniable. In this high-altitude cage, they were the only two people who truly existed. He wasn't a gangster to her in that moment, and she wasn't a stray he had picked up from the rain. They were two broken halves of a world that had tried to grind them into nothing. "You're not red, Arthur," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "Not to me." His gaze darkened, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. The air between them felt thick, charged with the electricity of a coming storm. He moved closer, his other hand finding the small of her back, pulling her toward the hard planes of his chest. Helena felt the heat of him, the sheer power he radiated even in his wounded state. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of two desperate souls, a frantic search for something real in a life built on shadows and lies. The kiss tasted of wine and salt, a slow-burning fire that threatened to consume the sterile perfection of the penthouse. Arthur's hands moved with a possessive urgency, sliding up to cradle her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. For Helena, the world outside, the debt, the streets, the fear, simply ceased to exist. There was only the pressure of his mouth, the strength of his arms, and the terrifying realization that she was falling for the very man who could be her undoing. They broke apart eventually, both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. The city lights of São Paulo twinkled below them like fallen stars, indifferent to the drama unfolding 40 stories above. "I can't promise you safety, Helena," Arthur said, his voice ragged. "I can't even promise you tomorrow." "I've never had a tomorrow," she replied, her voice soft but fierce. "I only have now." For the next few days, a fragile peace settled over them. They ate together every night, the table set with fine china and the simple, soulful food Helena prepared. Arthur told her stories of London, not the crimes, but the way the fog looked over the Thames and the sound of the bells at midnight. In return, she told him about the hidden gardens of São Paulo and the way the air smelled just before a summer downpour. It was a taste of normalcy, a simulation of a life where they were just a man and a woman in love. But the world Arthur had fled was not one that allowed for such luxuries. One Tuesday, while the sun was beginning to set in a riot of orange and purple, the peace was shattered. They were in the living room. Arthur was showing Helena a first-edition book he had acquired years ago, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. The intimacy of the moment was profound, a quiet domesticity that seemed to defy their reality. Then the chime sounded. It wasn't a doorbell or a knock. It was the specific, high-pitched trill of a burner phone, one of the three Arthur kept in a locked drawer in his mahogany desk. Arthur froze. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating steel of the London enforcer. He didn't say a word as he walked to the desk, his movements precise and lethal. He took out the phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Speak," he said. Helena watched him from the sofa, the coldness from the air conditioner suddenly feeling like ice against her skin. She saw the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the phone. She saw the mask of the ghost of London slide back into place, erasing the man who had kissed her with such desperate tenderness only nights before. Arthur listened for a full minute, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke a single sentence, in a voice that chilled Helena to her core. "I thought I burned those bridges in London." He ended the call and stood motionless, looking out at the sprawling metropolis. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. "Arthur?" Helena asked, her voice trembling. "What is it?" He didn't turn around. His silhouette against the twilight was jagged and sharp. "The Syndicate," he said, his voice a low hiss. "They didn't just find a trail, Helena. They found a name. Someone in London talked, and now someone is on a flight to Brazil." Helena stood up, her heart racing. The taste of normalcy was gone, replaced by the bitter copper of fear. She realized then that their sanctuary was no longer a home. It was a target. And as Arthur finally turned to look at her, she saw not the man she had cared for, but a predator who knew he was being hunted. "Pack a small bag," Arthur commanded, his eyes devoid of the warmth they had held moments ago. "The ghost is about to be seen." Before she could move, the light on his security monitor flickered, showing a black sedan pulling up to the main gate of the building, a car that didn't belong to any of the residents. By the middle of December of last year, the humid heat of a São Paulo summer had settled over the city like a heavy, damp wool blanket. Inside the penthouse, the air conditioning hummed with a discreet, expensive constancy, creating a climate that felt entirely disconnected from the sweltering chaos of the streets below. For Helena, the temperature wasn't the only thing that had changed. The woman who had once scavenged for discarded crusts of bread was now surrounded by the finest silks and laces that the boutiques of the Jardins district could offer. Arthur had become obsessed with her transformation. It began with a few simple dresses to replace her tattered rags, but it quickly spiraled into a daily ritual of deliveries. Men in crisp uniforms arrived at the service entrance throughout the week, bearing boxes embossed with gold lettering. Inside were emerald green evening gowns, soft cashmere sweaters, and high-heeled shoes that cost more than Helena's father had ever earned in a year of honest labor. One afternoon, Arthur sat on the velvet sofa, a glass of amber scotch in his hand, watching Helena as she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was wearing a slip dress of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. Around her neck hung a delicate platinum chain with a single pear-shaped diamond that caught the fading light of the afternoon sun. "You look like you were born for this, Helena," Arthur said, his voice low and raspy. Helena didn't turn around. She watched the flickering lights of the city, the endless stream of cars looking like glowing insects on the arteries of the metropolis. "I feel like a bird in a shop window, Arthur. People look at a bird in a cage and think it's happy because the bars are made of gold, but a cage is still a cage." Arthur stood up, his presence filling the room. Since his injury in November, he had become increasingly restless, his protective instincts sharpening into something that felt dangerously close to possession. "It's not a cage, it's a fortress. Do you have any idea what's happening out there? The faction is looking for the man who escaped that warehouse in the port of Santos. They don't know my face yet, but they know someone is moving against them. Until I clear the board, you stay here, where I can see you. I used to sleep under the overpass on Avenida Paulista, Arthur." Helena turned to face him, her eyes flashing with a mix of gratitude and defiance. "I know what danger looks like. I survived it for 3 years without a man with a gun guarding the door. I need to breathe, I need to walk on the grass, not just look at it from 20 stories up." She moved toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't want to leave him, but she needed to know she still could. She needed to know that she wasn't just another asset he had acquired in his investments. Arthur moved faster than she expected. He intercepted her at the edge of the living room, his hand reaching out to catch her arm. He didn't squeeze, but the weight of his grip was an absolute command. "No," he said, the word final and cold. "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming surge of electricity. The air between them was thick, charged with the weeks of unspoken tension and the long nights she had spent tending to his wounds. He pulled her closer, his chest nearly touching hers. The scent of his expensive cologne, mixed with the faint metallic tang of the city and the sharp bite of scotch, filled her senses. "I've spent 15 years taking what I want and killing what I don't," Arthur murmured, his blue eyes searching hers. "I don't know how to do this, Helena. I don't know how to keep something I care about without locking it away." "Then learn," she challenged him, her breath hitching as he moved his other hand to the small of her back. The argument shifted in a heartbeat. The power struggle that had been simmering since she first walked into his kitchen erupted. Arthur didn't let go. Instead, he backed her against the glass window. The cool surface of the pane pressed against her back, while the heat of his body pressed against her front. He was a man of violence and shadows, a man who had fled an entire life in London, only to find himself trapped by the gaze of a girl who had nothing. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His hand moved from her back to her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than his anger. "You're a liability," he whispered against her lips. "Every second you're here, you're a reason for me to hesitate. And men like me don't survive hesitation." "Then don't hesitate," Helena replied, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't the polite, tentative gesture of a suitor. It was a collision. It was a desperate, hungry claim that spoke of the months of isolation they had shared in this high-altitude sanctuary. His mouth was hard and demanding, and Helena met him with a fervor born of her own loneliness. She felt the rough calluses of his hands against the smooth silk of her dress, the contrast a reminder of the worlds that separated them. The world outside, the crime, the debt, the bloodstains she had scrubbed from his shirts, melted away. For a few moments there was only the sound of their synchronized breathing and the heavy thrum of the city beneath them. Arthur's hands moved with a frantic sort of grace, exploring the woman he had tried so hard to treat as a servant, then a guest, and finally a prize. He pulled back just an inch, his lips swollen and his eyes dark with a vulnerability she had never seen. "If I let you in, Helena, there's no going back. You'll be part of a war you didn't start." "I've been at war since the day I was born, Arthur," she said, her voice steady. "At least now I know who I'm fighting for." He began to lead her toward the bedroom, his hand intertwined with hers, the golden cage suddenly feeling like a home. But the transition was brutally interrupted. From the mahogany desk in the corner, a sound cut through the silence of the penthouse. It wasn't the soft chime of the house phone or the sleek ring of the smartphone Arthur used for his legitimate business. It was the harsh, abrasive vibration of a burner phone, one of the three he kept hidden in a locked drawer. Arthur froze. His entire posture shifted in a fraction of a second, the lover disappearing and the soldier returning. He released Helena's hand and strode toward the desk. He pulled the small, cheap plastic phone from the drawer and stared at the screen. The number displayed was long, prefixed with a country code that Helena didn't recognize, but she saw the way Arthur's knuckles turned white as he gripped the device. He answered it without a word, pressing it to his ear. Helena watched him from the center of the room, the midnight blue silk of her dress shimmering in the low light. "Speak," Arthur commanded. He listened for 30 seconds, his face turning into a mask of cold stone. He didn't say another word. He ended the call and set the phone down on the desk with a quiet, ominous click. "Arthur," Helena asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" He looked at her, but it felt as if he were looking right through her, back across the Atlantic to the grey, rain-slicked streets of the East End. "The ghost has a name," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And he just landed at the airport in Guarulhos." Helena felt a chill that the tropical heat couldn't touch. The walls of their sanctuary felt thinner than they ever had before, and she realized that the shadow Arthur had been running from wasn't a memory anymore. It was a man, and he was already inside the city limits. The salt-heavy air of the Atlantic coast clung to everything, a thick, invisible shroud that made the fine silk of Helena's new blouse stick to her skin. It was a Friday in mid-December, and the drive from the high-altitude chill of São Paulo down the winding mountain roads to the port of Santos had been a descent into a different kind of heat. Beside her, Arthur handled the steering wheel of the black armored sedan with a practiced, effortless grace. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the corded muscles of his forearms and the faint, jagged scars that spoke of a life lived in the trenches of the London East End. Helena looked out the window, watching the endless parade of shipping containers, red, blue, and rusted orange, stacked like giant blocks against the horizon. She felt like an imposter in her tailored charcoal trousers and expensive leather loafers. Only a few months ago, she had been scouring the gutters for a dry place to sleep, her fingers numb from the cold. Now, she was the personal assistant to a man who moved millions of dollars across borders with a single phone call. "You're quiet," Arthur remarked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small space of the car. He didn't take his eyes off the road, but she could feel his awareness of her. It was a constant, shimmering thing between them, a tension that had only grown since the night she had stitched his side. "I'm just thinking about the scale of it all," Helena replied, gesturing toward the towering cranes of the port. "It's a different world down here." "It's the same world, Helena. Just different tools," Arthur said. He reached over, his hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the center console. The contact was electric. The warmth of his palm against the back of her hand sent a jolt through her that made her breath hitch. "Just stay close to me. Don't speak unless I ask you to, and keep your eyes open. You see things others miss, that's why I brought you." The compliment felt heavier than the jewelry he had bought her. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, not as a servant, but as a partner. They pulled into a private terminal, where a row of 10 shimmering high-end European SUVs sat like predatory animals under the harsh midday sun. These were the assets, vehicles destined for the private collections of the wealthy, but their door panels and chassis held secrets far more valuable than leather upholstery. Arthur stepped out of the car, and Helena followed, the humidity hitting her like a physical blow. A group of men waited for them near the lead vehicle. They were local Brazilians, their faces hardened by years of sun and toil, but they stood with a deference that showed they knew exactly who Arthur was. "Everything is in order, boss," one of them said in Portuguese, a man with a thick mustache and a scar running through his eyebrow. Arthur nodded, his expression shifting into the cold, impenetrable mask he wore for business. He began to inspect the shipment, moving with a predatory slowness. Helena stayed a few paces behind him, as they had practiced. While Arthur discussed logistics and manifests, Helena let her gaze wander. She wasn't looking at the cars. She was looking at the periphery. Beyond the circle of workers, near a stack of empty containers 40 yards away, she saw a movement. It was subtle, the glint of light on glass, the shift of a shadow where there should have been none. She scanned the area, her heart beginning to drum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There were 3 men. One was leaning against a forklift, seemingly bored, but he wasn't looking at his phone, he was staring fixedly at the back of Arthur's head. Another was positioned on a gantry crane above, his posture too rigid, his hands tucked inside a heavy jacket that was far too warm for a December afternoon in Santos. The third man was the one who chilled her blood. He was stepping out from behind a container, his eyes locked on Arthur, his hand reaching behind his back. "Arthur," Helena whispered, her voice low but urgent. He didn't turn immediately, a testament to his control. "What is it?" "The forklift on the left, the crane above, and the man in the blue shirt behind you," she said, her words coming out in a rapid, controlled stream. "They aren't dock workers. They're too still." Arthur's posture changed instantly. He didn't look around wildly. Instead, he reached out and gripped Helena's upper arm, pulling her firmly against his side. The sudden proximity, the hardness of his body against hers, was a startling contrast to the danger unfolding around them. "Get to the car," he commanded, his voice a sharp blade of ice. "Arthur! Now!" The man in the blue shirt drew a weapon, a submachine gun with a folding stock. The first burst of fire shredded the air just as Arthur shoved Helena toward the armored sedan. The sound was deafening, a staccato rhythm that echoed off the metal containers like a demonic drumline. Helena didn't scream. The years of surviving on the streets had burned the panic out of her, replacing it with a cold, hollow clarity. She dove into the driver's seat of the sedan, the keys already in the ignition. Arthur was behind the open door of the lead SUV, returning fire with a heavy-caliber handgun. Each shot he took was calculated, precise. He wasn't spraying bullets. He was hunting. Helena watched through the windshield as the man on the crane tumbled forward, his body hitting the concrete with a sickening thud. "Arthur, get in!" she yelled over the roar of the gunshots. The dock workers had scattered, diving for cover as more gunmen appeared from between the containers. It was a coordinated hit, a swarm designed to trap them in the terminal. Arthur fired 3 more rounds, providing himself a sliver of a window, and then he sprinted for the sedan. He dived into the passenger seat, just as a hail of bullets sparked against the armored glass of the windshield. "Drive!" he roared. Helena slammed the car into gear and floored the accelerator. The engine hummed with a powerful predatory growl as the heavy vehicle lurched forward. She steered with a white-knuckled grip, weaving through the maze of containers and fleeing workers. "Left! Go left!" Arthur shouted, leaning out the window to fire back at a motorcycle that had appeared in the rearview mirror. The adrenaline was a roar in Helena's ears. She took a sharp turn on 2 wheels, the tires screaming against the asphalt. She could hear the metal-on-metal clang of bullets hitting the rear of the car, but the armor held. As they cleared the main gate of the terminal, the motorcycle pursuer lost control, skidding across the oil-slicked road as Arthur's bullet found its mark. Helena didn't look back. She pushed the car faster, weaving through the heavy port traffic, her mind focused entirely on the road ahead. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had lost its meaning. Eventually the docks faded into the distance, and they began the long, winding climb back toward the city. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by their ragged breathing. Helena's hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the steering wheel tighter just to stay in the lane. "Pull over," Arthur said softly. She steered the car into a scenic turnout overlooking the sprawling valley. As soon as the car was in park, the silence rushed in, suffocating and thick. Helena leaned her head against the wheel, the reality of what had just happened crashing down on her. Arthur reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the back of her neck. He pulled her toward him, and Helena didn't resist. She slid across the center console and into his arms, her face buried in the crook of his neck. He smelled of gunpowder, expensive cologne, and the sharp tang of sweat. "You saved us," he whispered into her hair, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, possessive strength. "If you hadn't seen them—" "I just saw what was there," she sobbed, the first tears finally breaking through. Arthur pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. His blue eyes were no longer cold. They were burning with an intensity that terrified and enthralled her. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You're not a ghost, Helena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the only thing in this world that's real." He leaned in, and this time the kiss wasn't a question. It was a desperate, hungry collision of 2 people who had just stared death in the face and won. Helena clung to him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body arching toward his. In that moment, the penthouse, the cars, and the money didn't matter. There was only the heat of him and the terrifying realization that she was no longer just a girl he had taken in. She was a part of him now, woven into the dark fabric of his life. As they finally pulled apart, gasping for air, Arthur's gaze drifted to the floor of the car. His expression shifted, the warmth vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He reached down and picked up a small black leather notebook that had fallen out of his pocket during the struggle. Helena watched him, her heart still racing. He flipped it open, and for a second she saw a list of names. Some she recognized from the news, others she didn't. "We need to get back," Arthur said, his voice turning professional, distant. "The leak didn't come from Santos, it came from inside my own house." Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She thought of the ledger she had seen in his office, the names of the men he bribed, and the secret life she was now inextricably tied to. She realized that while they had escaped the port, the real danger was waiting for them back in the glass-walled sanctuary of the Jardines, hidden in the very files she was supposed to help him manage. The January heat in Sao Paulo was a physical weight, a humid blanket that even the high-tech climate control of the penthouse struggled to fully dissipate. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city shimmered in a haze of gray and gold. The skyscrapers of the Paulista Avenue district standing like sentinels in the smog. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic sweep of Helena's cloth against the mahogany surface of Arthur's desk. She had become more than a ghost, yet she still moved with the quiet efficiency of one. Her transformation was visible in the mirror. The hollows of her cheeks had filled out, Her hair shone with health, and the expensive silk lounge pants Arthur had bought her clung to her curves with a soft, mocking elegance. But inside, Helena felt a mounting pressure. The kiss they had shared against the glass weeks ago had changed the air between them. It was no longer just about survival. It was about a magnetic, dangerous attraction that threatened to pull her under. Arthur was away for the day, locked in meetings at the port of Santos, leaving Helena alone with the secrets of the apartment. She hadn't intended to pry. She was simply dusting, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the heavy desk, when she noticed the slight misalignment of the bottom drawer. It was a secret compartment, one she hadn't noticed in the 3 months she had lived there. With a heart that hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, Helena pressed a hidden catch. The wood groaned softly, revealing a slim, leather-bound ledger. She sat on the edge of his velvet chair, the scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and cold iron, clinging to the fabric. She opened the book, expecting to find bank accounts or lists of cargo. Instead, she found a meticulously handwritten record of human souls. It was a ledger of bribes, a map of the corruption that allowed Arthur to operate with such impunity in a foreign land. Helena's eyes blurred as she read the names of judges, port authorities, and high-ranking police officers. Then her breath hitched. There, near the bottom of a page dated November of last year, was a name that felt like a punch to the gut: Roberto. Roberto was a captain in the local military police. 2 years ago, when Helena was sleeping on a cardboard pallet under an overpass, Roberto had been the only man in uniform who hadn't looked at her with disgust. He had brought her a warm coat during the rare cold snaps and had once chased off a group of men who intended to do her harm. He had been the one spark of light in her darkest year. Now, seeing his name listed next to a payment of $5,000 the light went out. The realization was a cold blade in her chest. She wasn't just a guest of a businessman. She was the companion of a man who corrupted the very few good things left in the world. She was living off the proceeds of a system that kept people like her on the streets, while those meant to protect them lined their pockets. Finding what you were looking for? The voice was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Helena jumped, the ledger slipping from her fingers and thudding onto the Persian rug. Arthur stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh afternoon light. He had removed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the faint silver line of the scar she had tended to in November. His eyes, usually a piercing blue, were now the color of a frozen lake. He didn't move toward her, but the intensity of his gaze was a physical force. "Arthur, I was just cleaning," she stammered, her voice sounding thin and guilty even to her own ears. He crossed the room in 3 long, predatory strides. He didn't pick up the ledger. He stopped inches from her, his presence overwhelming. The heat between them, once a source of comfort, now felt like a fever. He reached out, his hand wrapping firmly around her upper arm. It wasn't violent, but it was an assertion of power, a reminder of who he was and where she came from. "Cleaning," he repeated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You've spent months being the perfect little ghost, Helena. And now I find you digging through the only things in this house that can put a bullet in my head." "Is it true?" she whispered, refusing to look away even as tears pricked her eyes. "Did you pay him? Roberto? He's a good man, Arthur. He helped me when I had nothing." Arthur's grip tightened slightly, his thumb brushing against the soft skin of her inner arm, a gesture that was both a threat and a caress. "There are no good men in this city, Helena. Only men who have a price and men who haven't been offered enough yet. I didn't make the world this way. I just learned how to survive in it, something I thought you understood." "I understood hunger," she snapped, her anger finally overriding her fear. "I understood being cold. I didn't understand that I was trading my soul for a gold-plated cage. You're not just a man in trouble, Arthur. You're a predator." Arthur pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. She could smell the faint scent of whiskey on his breath and the raw electric tension that always crackled between them. For a moment she thought he might strike her, or perhaps kiss her with the same desperation he had shown before. Instead, he let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A predator? You've eaten the food I bought with that money. You've slept in the silk sheets paid for by those bribes. You're not an innocent bystander, Helena. You're an accomplice. He released her arm so abruptly she stumbled back against the desk. He finally reached down and picked up the ledger, tucking it under his arm. His face settled into a mask of cold indifference, a look she hadn't seen since the first night he held a gun to her head. "I thought you were different," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I thought you were the one person in this world who didn't want a piece of me. But you're just like the rest of them, aren't you? Looking for leverage, looking for a way to stay on top." "That's not true," she cried, but he was already turning away. "Stay in your room tonight," he commanded, not looking back. "I have people coming. People who wouldn't be as charmed by your ghost routine as I've been. If I find you outside that door, I'll assume you've made your choice to leave. And if you leave Helena, you leave with nothing, just the way I found you." The rest of the evening was a blur of misery. Helena retreated to her bedroom, the luxury of the space now feeling like a tomb. She watched the sun set from her window, the sky turning a bruised purple. She heard the muffled sounds of men's voices in the living room, the heavy tread of boots, the clink of glasses, and the sharp staccato rhythm of a language that wasn't Portuguese. They were speaking English, not the polished, neutral English Arthur used with her, but a thick, guttural slang that sounded like the rain-slicked streets of a London she had only seen in movies. She pressed her ear to the door, her heart racing. Arthur's voice was there, strained and defensive. He was arguing with someone. The moral dilemma of the ledger was momentarily pushed aside by a new, sharper fear. The world Arthur had fled was no longer a distant memory. It was in the next room. She caught fragments of the conversation. "Not enough time, Dummer, the London office won't wait." And then a name that made the hair on her neck stand up. Julian. The coldness that had settled between her and Arthur felt like a triviality compared to the shadow that was now falling over the penthouse. She realized then that Arthur's anger hadn't just been about the ledger. It was the lash-out of a man who knew his time was running out. As the house grew quiet late into the night, Helena didn't sleep. She sat by the door, wrapped in a blanket, waiting for a sign that the danger had passed. But the silence that followed the departure of the visitors was even more terrifying. It was the silence of a trap being set. She didn't know that miles away in a dark hotel room overlooking the city, a man was looking at a photograph of her and Arthur standing on the balcony, a photograph taken only 2 days prior. The man smiled, a slow predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. Arthur had thought he was the only one with secrets in São Paulo, but the ghosts of London had long memories and even longer shadows. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the city felt less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield. The January heat in São Paulo was a heavy, suffocating blanket that even the high-tech climate control of the penthouse struggled to suppress. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city hummed with a restless energy, a concrete jungle sprawling toward an orange-bruised horizon. Inside, the silence between Arthur and Helena was brittle. The discovery of the ledger had created a chasm between them, a rift of suspicion that made every shared breath feel like a negotiation. Arthur moved through the vast living space like a caged predator, his steel-blue eyes never settling, his hand habitually hovering near the small of his back where his weapon rested. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her since finding her with his list of bribes. To him, the ledger was a map of his survival. To Helena, it was a list of lives he had compromised to maintain his throne. She sat at the long mahogany dining table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, waiting for the storm to break. She didn't want his money, and she certainly didn't want his secrets, but she had become a part of his world the moment she washed the blood from his ribs. The transition from the icy silence to total chaos began with a single vibrating pulse from a burner phone Arthur kept in a locked drawer. He didn't usually answer it. That phone was for ghosts. When he picked it up, his face drained of what little color the Brazilian sun had gifted him. He didn't say hello. He listened for 30 seconds, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the device. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, jagged rasp. "I thought you were at the bottom of the Thames, Julian." Helena froze. The name hung in the air like a poisoned mist. She had heard Arthur mutter that name in his sleep during the night she spent comforting him through his feverish nightmares. Julian was the shadow that had chased Arthur across the Atlantic, the partner who had become a parasite. Arthur ended the call and stood motionless, staring out at the city. Helena rose slowly, approaching him with the cautious grace of someone walking through a minefield. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, before she rested it on his shoulder. Through the thin linen of his shirt, his muscles were as hard as granite. "Arthur?" she whispered. He turned, and for the first time she saw true, unadulterated fear in his eyes. It wasn't the fear of a man who was afraid to die. It was the fear of a man who realized he was about to lose everything he had built. He didn't push her away. Instead, he pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her waist with a desperate, crushing intensity. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "He's here," Arthur murmured against her collarbone. "He's in the city. He knows about the port. He knows about the officials, and he knows about you, Helena." The sensuality of the moment was laced with dread. Helena felt the rough stubble of his jaw against her skin, the frantic beat of his heart against her chest. She stepped back just enough to look into his face, her hands cupping his cheeks. "Who is he? Tell me exactly what he wants." "He wants half," Arthur said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "He wants 50% of every reel, every dollar, every shipment that moves through Santos. He says it's back interest for the years I spent hiding. And if I don't give it to him, he's going to hand over my location and my digital signatures to the Interpol task force in Lyon. They've been looking for me for 5 years, Helena. If they find me, I don't just go to prison. I disappear into a black site." Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was a girl who had lived on the streets, a girl who had learned to read the intentions of dangerous men by the way they held their shoulders. She knew that a man like Julian didn't stop at 50%. He would take the half, then he would take the rest, and then he would eliminate the witness. "We can't give him anything," she said firmly. Arthur pulled her closer again, his hands sliding down her back, pressing her body against his. The physical proximity was their only language of comfort. He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of scotch and anxiety. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but a seal of a dark pact. He was a man who had spent his life controlling everything, but Julian was a variable he couldn't calculate. "He wants to meet," Arthur said, breaking the kiss but keeping his forehead pressed against hers. "He's at a hotel in the Jardins, only 5 blocks from here. He's bold. He knows I can't touch him without triggering the evidence he's set to be released automatically if he doesn't check in with his associates." The realization hit Helena with the force of a physical blow. Arthur was a king in São Paulo, but Julian had the keys to his kingdom's destruction. Throughout the rest of that Friday, the penthouse felt less like a luxury home and more like a high-altitude prison. Arthur began pacing again, making calls in low-tone English to men Helena didn't know. He was moving assets, trying to find a way to liquidate enough cash to satisfy a monster, but she could see in the way he looked at her that he was considering a much darker path. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor, Helena went to the kitchen. She began to cook, falling back on the promise she had made him on that rainy night in October. She chopped vegetables with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, the sound of the knife against the board, the only heartbeat of the room. She was making a traditional Brazilian stew, something thick and comforting, but her mind was miles away, navigating the labyrinth of Arthur's predicament. She remembered the ledger. She remembered the names of the men Arthur paid off. If Julian knew about the bribes, he knew the names too. But did he know the nature of the relationships? Arthur walked into the kitchen, his tie discarded, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deepened by the stress of the last 6 hours. He watched her for a moment, then moved behind her, his chest pressing against her back. He reached around her, his large hands covering hers, stopping the motion of the knife. "Stop," he whispered. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to be the ghost anymore." "I'm not doing it because I have to," she replied, turning in his arms. "I'm doing it because it's the only thing that feels real right now." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "Julian is a butcher, Helena. In London they called him the Eraser. He doesn't leave loose ends. If I go to this meeting, I need you to promise me something. If I don't come back in 3 hours, you take the bag in the floor safe. You take the passports. You go to the airport and you don't look back." Helena felt a surge of fierce, protective anger. "I didn't survive the streets of this city just to run away when things get difficult, Arthur. You kept me safe when I had nothing. I'm not leaving you now that you have everything to lose." The tension between them snapped into something more primal. Arthur gripped her waist, hoisting her up onto the marble countertop. The cold stone was a sharp contrast to the heat of his skin. He kissed her again, more deeply this time, his hands exploring the curves of her body with a possessive urgency. In that moment, the threat of Julian, the threat of Interpol, and the moral weight of the ledger faded into the background. There was only the sensation of his touch and the desperate need to feel alive in the face of impending disaster. But even as they clung to each other, the shadow of London was lengthening. A sudden sharp chime echoed through the penthouse, the front door's intercom. Arthur stiffened, his body turning into a weapon once more. He slid off the counter and reached for the monitor by the kitchen entrance. The screen flickered to life, showing the sleek, polished lobby downstairs. Standing there was a man in a perfectly tailored grey suit, holding a single red rose. He looked directly into the camera and smiled, a cold, empty expression that didn't reach his eyes. It was Julian. And he wasn't waiting for a meeting in a hotel. He was standing on their doorstep, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 large men in dark jackets stood with their hands hidden in their pockets, their eyes scanning the lobby with professional detachment. Arthur looked at Helena, his face a mask of cold resolve. "He's not waiting for an answer," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's coming up." The elevator hummed, a low, vibrating sound that felt like a countdown. Arthur grabbed Helena's hand, pulling her toward the back of the penthouse, toward the heavy steel door of his private office. "Hide in the crawl space behind the bookshelves. Don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, do not come out." As the elevator doors chimed at the end of the hallway, Helena realized that the man who had just arrived wasn't just looking for money. He was looking for the one thing Arthur couldn't bear to lose. And as the heavy mahogany door to the penthouse swung open, the first thing Julian said wasn't a demand for cash, but a question that chilled Helena to her very core. "Where is the little bird I've heard so much about, Arthur?" The humidity of a Thursday in January of last year hung heavy over São Paulo, a thick, invisible shroud that even the high-altitude winds of the penthouse couldn't fully disperse. Inside the glass-walled fortress, the air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous tune, but it did little to cool the feverish tension radiating from Arthur. For the first time since Helena had stepped into his world, the man who moved through life like a predator seemed hunted. He was sitting on the edge of the oversized leather sofa, his head buried in his hands. The lights were dimmed to a soft amber, casting long, distorted shadows across the marble floor. Helena watched him from the doorway of the kitchen, the place where she had once been a mere ghost, a girl bargaining for a dry floor and a hot meal. Now she was the only person allowed to see the king of the East End with his crown off. Arthur's breathing was ragged. He had been having the nightmares again. They weren't about the Brazilian factions or the police captains he had on his payroll. They were about a damp grey alleyway in London 30 years ago, where a boy had learned that blood was the only currency that never devalued. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice a soft anchor in the dark. He flinched, his shoulders tensing as he looked up. His blue eyes, usually as cold as a winter sea, were bloodshot and clouded with a raw, unadulterated vulnerability. "I can still smell the Thames," he rasped, his voice thick with a phantom memory. "The salt and the rot. I thought I'd left it 6,000 miles behind, Helena. But Julian, he brought it all back with him. He's the walking ghost of every sin I ever committed." Helena moved toward him, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She didn't hesitate this time. She sat beside him, the silk of her robe brushing against his rough denim jeans. She placed a hand on his back, feeling the tremor that ran through his powerful frame. It was a strange, intoxicating reversal of roles. The man who had held a silenced pistol to her head was now leaning into her touch, as if it were the only thing keeping him from shattering. "You aren't that boy anymore," she said, her voice firm. And you aren't alone. You told me once that trust was a luxury you couldn't afford. But look at us. I'm still here. I didn't run when the bullets flew at the docks, and I didn't run when I found that ledger." Arthur turned his head, his face inches from hers. The scent of expensive bourbon and tobacco clung to him, a masculine musk that made Helena's heart hammer against her ribs. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Why stay with a man who has a target on his back?" "Because you gave me a home when I was nothing," she replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the slight stubble there. "And because I think, underneath all the steel and the threats, you're just as lost as I was. We're two people who don't belong anywhere, Arthur. That makes us a country of our own." The air between them charged with a sudden electric heat. Arthur reached out, his large hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her closer. It wasn't a gesture of dominance, but one of desperate necessity. When his lips met hers, it tasted of salt and sorrow, a slow-burning fire that spoke of two souls clinging to one another in the middle of a hurricane. The kiss deepened, his other hand sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Helena felt the heat of his body, the strength he tried so hard to project and the softness he only showed to her. In that moment, the hierarchy of master and servant dissolved completely, replaced by a bond forged in the shadow of death. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, the vulnerability remained, but it was tempered with a new, shared resolve. Arthur pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "Julian is going to come for me at Carnival," Arthur said, his voice regaining its professional edge. "He thinks I'm weak because I've built something here. He thinks I've gone soft in the sun. He doesn't know about you. He thinks you're just a girl I picked up to keep the bed warm." "Let him think that," Helena said, her eyes flashing with a coldness that mirrored his own. "Teach me, Arthur. Teach me how to be the person he doesn't see coming." The training began that very night. It started with the weight of a weapon. Arthur took her to his private study, unlocking a hidden compartment behind a row of leather-bound books. He pulled out a sleek black semi-automatic. He checked the chamber and handed it to her, his hands steady. "A gun is just a tool, Helena," he whispered, standing behind her. He wrapped his arms around her, his chest pressed against her back, his hands guiding hers as they lifted the weapon. "It doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have a conscience. You have to be the one to provide those things, or leave them at the door." He showed her how to stand, how to breathe between heartbeats, and how to feel the trigger's wall. The physical proximity was distracting. The warmth of his breath against her ear, the way his muscles shifted against her as he corrected her stance. But Helena forced herself to focus. She was a quick study, her years on the streets having already taught her the value of observation and the necessity of quick reflexes. Over the next week, the lessons moved beyond the mechanical. They sat for hours on the balcony, watching the city below, as Arthur taught her the art of the tell. "Look at that man at the cafe across the street," Arthur said, pointing toward a small table 10 floors down. "The one in the linen suit. What do you see?" Helena squinted. "He's reading a newspaper. He's been there for 20 minutes. "Look at his feet," Arthur corrected. "They aren't tucked under the chair. They're pointed toward the exit. He's not reading, Helena. He's waiting. A man who is truly relaxing lets his posture go. A man who is working is always ready to spring." They practiced until Helena's mind felt as sharp as a razor. She learned how to spot a tail, how to use a mirror to see behind her without turning her head, and how to hide a small blade in the hem of a dress so that it could be drawn in a single fluid motion. She was no longer the girl who cleaned his floors. She was becoming his shadow, his second set of eyes. But as the days ticked closer to the start of February, the weight of their pact began to take a toll. The penthouse, once a sanctuary, felt more like a cage. Every phone call made Arthur jump. Every unexpected shadow in the hallway made Helena reach for the knife she now kept tucked into her waistband. On the final night before they were to depart for the chaos of the celebrations, Arthur stood by the window, looking out at the sprawling, glittering expanse of São Paulo. The city was already beginning to pulse with the distant beat of drums, a rhythmic tribal sound that signaled the coming of Carnival. "If this goes wrong," Arthur said, not turning around, There's a bag in the floorboard of the guest room. It has $40,000 in cash and a passport with a different name. You take it and you go to the border. Don't look back for me." Helena walked up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I'm not leaving you, Arthur. We're going to walk into that box at the Sambadrome, and we're going to walk out. Together." Arthur turned in her arms, his expression unreadable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Inside was a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a single blood-red ruby. "I bought this for you," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Not as a gift for a servant, but as a mark, so that everyone knows you belong to a man who would burn this entire city to the ground to keep you safe." He fastened the necklace around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. The ruby rested against the hollow of her throat, feeling like a drop of warm blood. Helena looked at her reflection in the darkened glass of the window. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked like a queen, but there was a hunger in her eyes that was entirely new. The moment of intimacy was shattered by the sharp, persistent buzzing of Arthur's encrypted phone. He pulled it out, his face pale as he read the message. "It's Julian," Arthur said, his voice turning to ice. "He's changed the location. He doesn't want to meet in the private box anymore. He wants us to meet him in the heart of the parade, in the middle of the North Zone. He says he has a surprise for us, a guest I haven't seen in 20 years. Arthur's hand gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. Helena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The North Zone was Julian's territory, a labyrinth of narrow streets where the police never ventured. "Who is it, Arthur?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is the guest?" Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with a sudden, blinding terror. "The man who taught me how to kill," he said. "The man I thought I murdered 2 decades ago." The heat of February of last year was unlike anything Helena had ever experienced. It was a thick, wet blanket that draped over the city of Rio de Janeiro, smelling of sea salt, fried street food, and the sweat of millions of revelers. They had traveled from the concrete labyrinth of São Paulo to the coast, following the siren song of the world's largest party, though for Arthur and Helena the music felt more like a funeral dirge. In the suite of their hotel overlooking the Atlantic, the air conditioning hummed a low mechanical tune. Helena stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, staring at a woman she barely recognized. She wore a dress of shimmering gold sequins that caught the light like scales on a predatory fish. It was backless, held up by the thinnest of silk threads, and slit high enough on the thigh to allow for movement, or for the concealment of the razor-sharp blade strapped to her inner leg. Beneath the swell of her breast, tucked into the reinforced bodice of the dress, sat a recording device no larger than a coin. Arthur stepped into the frame behind her. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, the fabric so fine it looked like liquid under the vanity lights. He didn't wear a tie. The top buttons of his white shirt were open, revealing the faint, jagged line of the scar she had stitched together months ago. He looked like a man of leisure, a wealthy European tourist, but his eyes were the cold steel blue of a winter sea. "You look breathtaking," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He placed his hands on her waist, his palms warm through the thin fabric. The touch sent a familiar jolt through her, a mixture of desire and the high-octane adrenaline that had become their daily bread. Helena turned in his arms, her hands resting on his chest. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. "I look like a target," she corrected softly. "In this world, Helena, beauty is the best armor. They'll be so busy looking at the curve of your neck that they won't notice the fire in your eyes." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of mint and unspoken promises. For a moment, the danger outside the door vanished. There was only the weight of his body against hers, the scent of his expensive cologne, and the terrifying realization that she would do anything to keep him alive. "If Julian suspects anything," she started, but Arthur silenced her with a thumb against her lip. "Julian is a man of ego. He thinks he's the architect of this meeting. Let him believe he's in control." Arthur pulled away, his expression hardening into the mask of the man who had survived the London underworld. "Keep the recorder running," Don't speak unless he addresses you. You are the trophy tonight, Helena. Play the part of the girl who only cares about the champagne and the music." They left the hotel and were swept into the chaos of the city. The Sambadrome was an architectural scar of white concrete filled with nearly 75,000 screaming fans. The air vibrated with the thunderous rhythm of the percussion sections, a heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the very ground. As they were led toward the private boxes, the VIP areas where the elite and the criminal mingled, the noise became a physical force. Julian was waiting for them in a lavish suite draped in velvet and filled with chilled magnums of French wine. He was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked too heavy for the tropical night. He didn't rise when they entered. He simply gestured to the plush chairs facing the parade route below, where a sea of dancers in plumes of neon feathers moved like a living river of fire. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice carrying the sharp, clipped accent of East London, "you've done well for yourself in the colonies, and this—" He turned his gaze toward Helena, his eyes raking over her with a clinical, predatory interest. "You didn't mention the local scenery was quite so spectacular." "She's not scenery, Julian," Arthur said, his voice level, though Helena felt the tension radiating from him like heat from a radiator. He sat down, pulling Helena close so that her side was pressed against his arm. "Of course not. A man of your taste always looks for quality," Julian sneered. He poured 3 glasses of amber liquid, not wine, but a heavy, peat-smoked scotch. He pushed one toward Arthur and one toward Helena. "To old friends, and to the future of our shared interests." Helena took a sip, the alcohol burning her throat, but her mind was elsewhere. She was acutely aware of the small device pressed against her skin, capturing every word. She looked out at the parade, watching the massive floats, golden lions, towering goddesses, and skeletal figures pass by. The juxtaposition of the joy below and the malice in this room was sickening. Julian leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I've been looking at your books, Arthur. You've built a very tidy empire here, but you've forgotten where you came from. The family in London doesn't like being forgotten. We invested in you, we expect a return." "I sent the agreed-upon percentages for 5 years," Arthur replied, his voice dropping an octave. "Until you tried to have me intercepted at the border. Our contract ended when you put a price on my head." Julian laughed, a dry, rasping sound that was lost to everyone but them in the cacophony of the drums. "Business is business, but I'm a reasonable man. 50% of everything you touch in South America, and I tell the boys back home that you're more valuable alive than dead. Otherwise—" He glanced at Helena, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "I start taking my payment in other ways." Helena felt a cold shiver trace her spine. Arthur's hand tightened on her hip, his fingers digging slightly into her skin. It was a warning, a silent command to stay still. "You're overplaying your hand, Julian," Arthur said. "This isn't London. You have no friends here. You're a ghost in a city that doesn't know your name." "Is that so?" Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, cracked mobile phone. He slid it across the table. On the screen was a grainy, live feed image. Helena leaned in, her heart stopping. It showed a man tied to a chair in a dark, damp room. He was battered, his face a map of bruises, but she recognized him. It was Lucas, the driver and bodyguard, who had been with Arthur since he arrived in Brazil, the only man Arthur truly called a friend. Julian leaned back, crossing his legs. He was very difficult to catch, loyal to a fault. But everyone has a breaking point, Arthur. Usually it's when they realize their master is too busy enjoying the carnival to save them. The drums below reached a crescendo, the sound shaking the glass walls of the suite. Helena looked at Arthur, seeing the flicker of agony in his eyes before he masked it with cold fury. The trap wasn't just about money or territory, it was about the soul Arthur had been trying so hard to reclaim. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. Julian's eyes gleamed with a sickening triumph. "The parade ends in 2 hours. By the time the last float passes the finish line, you will give me the codes to your offshore accounts, or I will send you a video of your friend's final moments. And then—" He leaned closer, his breath smelling of smoke and malice. "I'll see if your lovely companion here is as loyal as he was." Helena felt the weight of the blade against her leg. She looked at Arthur, waiting for a signal, a glance, anything. But Arthur was staring at the screen, at the broken man who had served him for years. The golden cage of the penthouse felt 1,000 miles away, and the vibrant streets of Rio had suddenly become a graveyard. As a new wave of dancers entered the stadium, their silver sequins reflecting the stadium lights like 1,000 tiny mirrors, Julian stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony. "Choose carefully, Arthur. Blood is much harder to wash out of silk than Scotch." Helena reached out under the table, her hand finding Arthur's. His grip was frantic, a silent communication of the impossible choice he now faced. She felt the recording device humming against her ribs, a piece of evidence that might save them, or the very thing that would get them killed before the night was over. Beyond the glass, the music played on, a joyous mask for the violence unfolding in the shadows of the VIP box. The countdown had begun, and the first drop of rain began to fall from the black Brazilian sky. The heat of Rio de Janeiro in late February of last year was a living thing, a thick, humid weight that settled over the city like a damp wool blanket. Inside the private box at the Sambadrome, the air conditioning struggled against the sheer sensory onslaught of carnival. Below them, the Marquês de Sapucaí was a river of gold, emerald and sapphire, thousands of dancers moving in a rhythmic tribal trance to the deafening thunder of the bateria. For the world outside this glass-walled sanctuary, it was a night of liberation. For Helena and Arthur, it was a gilded cage where the price of admission was likely to be paid in blood. Helena stood by the window, her body draped in a dress of shimmering silver silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. To any observer, she was the quintessential trophy, a beautiful young woman enjoying the spoils of a powerful man. But beneath the delicate fabric, strapped to her inner thigh, was a razor-sharp ceramic blade, and nestled in the hollow of her throat, disguised as a heavy obsidian pendant, was a high-sensitivity recording device. She felt Arthur's presence behind her before he touched her. The scent of his expensive cologne, mingled with the faint metallic tang of the city, acted as a strange anchor. He placed his hands on her waist, his thumbs tracing the line of her hips through the silk. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a mixture of genuine desire and the heightened adrenaline of the moment. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just below her ear. To the cameras in the room, it looked like a lover's whisper. "Stay close to me," Arthur murmured, his voice a low vibration that she felt more than heard. "If things go south, you head for the north exit. Do not look back for me. Do you understand?" Helena turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart through his linen shirt. For a man facing his executioner, he was impossibly calm. "I'm not leaving you, Arthur. We made a pact." His eyes, usually the color of a cold Atlantic morning, softened for a fraction of a second. He tightened his grip on her, pulling her flush against him. The heat of his body was a stark contrast to the chilled air of the box. In that brief embrace, the world outside, the drums, the screaming crowds, the looming threat of Julian, ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, two broken souls who had found a jagged kind of peace in each other's arms. He kissed her then, a hard, desperate pressure that tasted of salt and the looming shadow of the end. The door to the suite opened, and the spell was shattered. Julian entered, followed by two men whose suits couldn't hide the bulk of the hardware they carried beneath their jackets. Julian was a man of 60, with a face like etched granite, and eyes that had seen every horror London's East End had to offer. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a shark that had finally cornered its prey. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the muffled roar of the parade. "You always had a taste for the finer things. I see Brazil has treated you well. And this must be the girl who turned a wolf into a lapdog." Arthur stepped in front of Helena, his posture shifting into something predatory and lethal. "Julian, you're a long way from home. I assume you didn't fly 10,000 miles just to critique my company." Julian chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He gestured to one of his men, who stepped aside to reveal a figure slumped in a chair in the corner of the room, hidden until now by the shadows. Helena stifled a gasp. It was Lucas, Arthur's most loyal driver, and the man who had helped them navigate the treacherous streets of São Paulo for months. His face was a mask of bruises, his hands zip-tied behind his back. "Lucas is a good lad," Julian said, pouring himself a glass of vintage scotch from the sideboard. "Very loyal. Didn't want to say a word about where you'd gone after the port of Santos. But everyone has a breaking point, don't they?" Arthur's jaw tightened, a small muscle pulsing in his cheek. "Let him go, Julian. This is between you and me." "It could be," Julian agreed, taking a slow sip of his drink. "But I need to know if the rumors are true. They say you've gone soft, Arthur. They say you've traded your spine for a pretty face and a penthouse view. So here is the deal. Prove them wrong, kill the boy. Show me that the man who ran the docks in London is still in there, and perhaps I'll let you keep your little bird here. Refuse, and I'll take her back to London with me. I'm sure my associates would find many uses for someone of her talents." The room went deathly silent. Even the roar of the Sambadrome seemed to fade into a dull hum. Helena felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her lungs. She looked at Arthur, seeing the agony behind his stoic mask. He had spent his life avoiding the very thing he was now being asked to do, betraying the few people who actually cared for him. Arthur looked at Lucas, whose eyes were swollen shut, but who managed a weak, definitive shake of his head. Then Arthur looked at Helena. The love in his gaze was a physical blow. He reached into his waistband, pulling out a sleek black handgun. He checked the chamber with a practiced mechanical click. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered, but Helena wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to Lucas. As Arthur began to raise the weapon, Helena knew she had to move. She didn't think, she simply acted on the street-honed instincts that had kept her alive when she had nothing but a backpack to her name. She reached for the heavy silver ice bucket on the sideboard and flung it with all her might toward the glass window facing the parade. The heavy crystal shattered, and the full, unrestrained roar of the batteria flooded the room like a physical shockwave. The sudden explosion of sound and light distracted Julian's men for a split second. In that window, Helena lunged for the light switch, plunging the suite into darkness. "Run!" she screamed. She heard the deafening roar of a gunshot, the muzzle flash illuminating Arthur's face for a heartbeat. He wasn't aiming at Lucas. He was aiming at the man holding the door. Chaos erupted. Helena felt a hand grab her arm, pulling her through the darkness. She slashed downward with the ceramic blade she had pulled from her thigh, feeling it bite into leather and then skin. A grunt of pain followed, and the grip loosened. "Helena!" Arthur's voice was a beacon. She found his hand in the dark, his fingers interlacing with hers, their palms sweaty and trembling. They scrambled over the shattered glass, leaping from the private box onto the lower tier of the bleachers. The crowd was a sea of feathers and sweat, thousands of people jumping in unison to the beat of the drums. They were swallowed by the masses, two specks of silver and black in a kaleidoscope of color. They ran through the tunnels of the Sambadrome, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow looked like Julian's men. Every loud pop of a firework sounded like a gunshot. They emerged into the sweltering night of Rio, the streets clogged with revelers, and the air thick with the smell of grilled meat and cheap beer. They didn't stop until they reached a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks away, where a bleeding but conscious Lucas was already waiting, having escaped through the back service entrance Helena's distraction had cleared. As they tore away from the curb, the tires screeching against the asphalt, Helena collapsed against the leather seat. Arthur reached out, his hand shaking as he touched her face, checking for injuries. His shirt was torn, and his knuckles were split, but he was alive. "We have to get out of the city," Arthur said, his voice strained. "Julian won't stop. He has eyes everywhere. The airports, the bus stations. He'll have them all watched." Helena nodded, her mind already racing. She looked at the recording device at her throat, the obsidian pendant still intact. She had the evidence of Julian's threats, but it wouldn't be enough to stop him tonight. "I know a place," Arthur said, looking at the GPS. "A villa in Minas Gerais. It's off the books. No one knows I bought it." Helena reached over, covering his hand with hers. They were safe for the moment, but the look in Arthur's eyes told her that the cost of their escape was higher than she realized. As the lights of Rio faded in the rearview mirror, she felt a cold shiver down her spine. Julian's last words echoed in her mind. He hadn't sounded like a man who had lost. He had sounded like a man who was just getting started. "Arthur," she whispered as they hit the open highway. "He said he knew the rumors. That means someone told him. Someone closer than Lucas." Arthur didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white, the silence between them growing heavy with the realization that the enemy wasn't just behind them. They might already be waiting for them at the end of the road. The air in the mountains of Minas Gerais was a sharp, cool contrast to the suffocating, humid heat of Rio de Janeiro. It was a Saturday in March of last year, when Arthur steered the dusty black SUV through the iron gates of a villa tucked so deeply into the Emerald Hills that it seemed to belong to another century. The house was a colonial relic, built with thick stone walls and a red-tiled roof that had weathered decades of torrential rains. For Helena, it was the first time in many years that she felt the weight in her chest begin to dissipate. They had been driving for nearly 10 hours, navigating the winding roads that cut through coffee plantations and sleepy colonial towns. Arthur was silent for most of the journey, his knuckles white against the leather of the steering wheel. He was a man who lived by his senses, and those senses were currently screaming that the walls were closing in. But as the villa came into view, surrounded by a fortress of ancient jacaranda trees, his posture finally softened. "This place isn't on any map Julian would have access to," Arthur said, his voice raspy from the lack of sleep. He didn't look at her, but he reached out, his hand finding hers on the center console. His palm was calloused and warm, a stark reminder of the violence he was capable of and the protection he offered. Helena squeezed his hand back. "We can breathe here, Arthur, just for a little while." The interior of the villa was a sanctuary of dark wood and white linen. It smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. There were no cameras here, no tinted glass windows overlooking a predatory city. There was only the sound of the wind whistling through the valley and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. That first night, Helena didn't cook out of necessity or a desire to prove her worth. She cooked because she wanted to nourish the man who had become her entire world. She prepared a simple meal of roasted chicken and root vegetables, the steam rising in the dim light of the kitchen. As they sat at a small wooden table, the candlelight flickering between them, the atmosphere shifted. The frantic energy of their escape from the Sambadrome began to settle into something deeper and more carnal. Arthur watched her move, his blue eyes tracking the way the light caught the gold necklace he had given her. A heavy, beautiful thing that she no longer felt was a shackle. "You shouldn't be here," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. "You should be in a world where you don't have to carry a blade under your silk dress." Helena stood and walked around the table, stopping behind him. She placed her hands on his shoulders, feeling the knots of tension in his muscles. "I was a ghost before I met you, Arthur. I was invisible, drifting through streets where no one cared if I lived or died. You gave me a place to stand. You gave me a reason to fight." He turned in his chair, pulling her toward him so that she stood between his knees. His hands settled on her hips, his fingers digging slightly into the fabric of her trousers. The physical proximity was electric, a slow-burning fire that had been smoldering since the night she had stitched his side in the penthouse. "I didn't give you a life, Helena. I gave you a target on your back," he countered, his gaze searching hers. "Then we'll share it," she replied softly. He pulled her down into a deep, searching kiss. It wasn't the desperate, frantic embrace of the penthouse window. It was slow, deliberate, and tasted of a shared future they both feared to name. His hands moved up her back, pulling her closer until there was no space between them. In the quiet of the Minas Gerais night, the world of London syndicates and Brazilian factions felt like a fever dream. Here, they were just a man and a woman, stripped of their titles and their armors. The days that followed were a blur of quiet intimacy. They spent their mornings walking through the overgrown gardens, Arthur pointing out the different types of birds, while Helena gathered wild herbs for their meals. For the first time, Arthur spoke of his childhood, without the veneer of the hardened gangster. He spoke of a mother who had worked 3 jobs in the East End, and a father who was more a shadow than a man. "I thought money was the only thing that could buy safety," Arthur admitted one afternoon, as they sat on the stone veranda, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the peaks. "I spent 20 years building a fortress of gold and iron, only to realize I was the one trapped inside." Helena leaned her head on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the faded scars on his forearm. Maybe the fortress wasn't for safety. Maybe it was just to keep people from seeing who was inside. Arthur looked at her, his expression vulnerable in a way that would have terrified his subordinates in London. He was considering it, the possibility of walking away. He had enough hidden accounts to ensure they could live 100 lives in 100 different countries. They could buy a ranch in the south, change their names, and let the world forget Arthur ever existed. It was a beautiful, fragile hope. But the reality of their lives was not easily discarded. Arthur still slept with a handgun on the nightstand, and Helena still found herself checking the perimeter of the house every time a floorboard creaked. The peace was a thin veil, and they both knew it. On their 4th night at the villa, the air turned heavy with an impending storm. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and bringing with it the scent of wet earth. They were in the master bedroom, the large 4-poster bed draped in sheer mosquito netting. The intimacy between them had reached a peak. They moved together with a familiarity that felt ancient. Arthur's touch was reverent, his lips tracing the line of her throat as he whispered promises of a life far from the reach of men like Julian. "We'll leave on Monday," Arthur murmured against her skin, his heart beating a steady rhythm against her chest. "We'll go to the border, and we won't look back." Helena nodded, her eyes closed as she savored the warmth of his body. For a few hours she allowed herself to believe it. She allowed herself to imagine a morning where she didn't have to look for shadows in the corner of the room. The shift happened just as the first crack of thunder echoed through the valley. Arthur had left his 2 burner phones on the antique dresser across the room. They were supposed to be dead, their batteries removed, and their signals ghosted. It was a standard precaution, one he had taught Helena himself. But in the sudden silence between the rolls of thunder, a faint rhythmic vibration began to emanate from the wood of the dresser. Arthur froze. He sat up, his muscles tensing instantly, the softness of the last few days evaporating in a single heartbeat. "Arthur?" Helena whispered, the coldness already seeping back into her bones. He didn't answer. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand hovering over the phones. One of them, the one he had used to coordinate the escape from Rio, was glowing. The screen was black, but the vibration was unmistakable. It wasn't a call, it was a pinger. His face went pale in the flashes of lightning illuminating the room. He realized the fatal mistake. In the chaos of the Sambadrome, in the rush of blood and adrenaline, he had trusted a device that had been compromised long before they reached the mountains. "He's here," Arthur said, his voice a low, guttural growl. He grabbed his weapon and crossed to the window, peeling back the heavy velvet curtain just an inch. Below, in the darkness of the driveway, the sensors on the gate didn't flare, but the jacaranda trees were swaying in a way that wasn't caused by the wind. A set of infrared beams flickered briefly against the stone wall of the garden. Helena stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't reach for her clothes. She reached for the small leather-bound kit she kept under her pillow. The peace had lasted 4 days. The war had found them in the dark. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the terror. Arthur watched the shadows move with a precision that didn't belong to local thieves. These were Julian's men trained in the same cold, efficient school of violence as Arthur himself. "Enough to finish it," Arthur replied, turning back to her. His eyes were no longer the soft blue of a lover. They were the hard, flinty steel of the man she had met in the penthouse. "Get to the basement. There's a crawl space behind the wine cellar." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her jaw setting. Outside, the first flash of a muzzle flared in the tree line, and the heavy thud of a suppressed round shattered the glass of the veranda door downstairs. The siege had begun, and the mountain sanctuary was about to become a slaughterhouse. The mist in the valleys of Minas Gerais was thick and milky on that Sunday morning in March of last year. It clung to the red earth and the emerald hills, swallowing the world in a silent, damp embrace. Inside the villa, the air smelled of wood smoke and the strong, dark coffee Helena had just finished brewing. For a few days, They had lived in a dream, a fragile, beautiful illusion where Arthur was not a hunted man and she was not a girl who had once slept on cardboard. They had spent the previous night tangled in silk sheets, their bodies speaking a language of desperate, newfound hope. But as the first grey light of dawn touched the terracotta roof tiles, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of tires on gravel. Arthur was out of bed before the first engine cut out. He didn't need to look through the window to know that the piece was over. His movements were fluid, a grim muscle memory taking over as he reached for the heavy black case under the bed. Helena sat up, the sheets pooling around her waist, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Helena, get to the cellar," Arthur whispered, his voice like grinding stones. He was already pulling on a dark shirt, his eyes scanning the room for exits. "Now." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice trembling but certain. She had spent 24 years running from things and she was done. She stood, finding her clothes in the dim light, her hands shaking as she pulled on her boots. The first shot didn't sound like a movie. It was a sharp, ugly crack that shattered the glass of the kitchen window downstairs. Then came the roar of automatic fire, a deafening crescendo that tore through the morning stillness. Julian had found them. He hadn't come for a conversation or a negotiation. He had come to erase them. "They're coming from the front and the east side," Arthur shouted over the din. He handed her a small, sleek pistol. "Only use it if they get close. Do you understand? Stay behind me." The villa, which had felt like a sanctuary only an hour ago, was now a death trap. Dust and plaster rained down as bullets chewed through the walls. Arthur moved through the hallway with a lethal precision, returning fire with a steady hand. Helena followed, her senses heightened to a terrifying degree. She knew this land better than the men outside did. During her wanderings, she had learned how to read the slopes of the hills and the density of the brush. "For the back orchard," she hissed as they reached the kitchen, which was now littered with glass and the smell of spilled coffee. "There's a drainage gully behind the stone wall. If we can reach the trees, they won't see us in the mist." Arthur nodded, but before they could move, a flashbang grenade detonated against the patio doors. The world turned into a white, screaming void. Helena was thrown back against the cupboards, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Through the haze of smoke and light, she saw a shadow step through the shattered door. A man in tactical gear, his rifle raised. Arthur didn't hesitate. He tackled the man, the two of them crashing into the center island. It was a brutal, primal struggle. Helena watched, frozen for a heartbeat, before her instincts kicked in. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the counter and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed, catching the attacker in the temple. The man went limp, and Arthur rolled off him, gasping for air. "Go!" Arthur yelled, grabbing her hand. They sprinted toward the back of the house, but as they crossed the threshold of the mudroom, a second wave of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Arthur suddenly jerked, his body twisting as a bullet found its mark in his right shoulder. He didn't scream, but the guttural groan that escaped his lips sent a chill down Helena's spine. He collapsed against the doorframe, blood instantly blooming across the fabric of his shirt, a dark, hot crimson. "Arthur!" she cried, catching him before he hit the floor. "Keep moving," he wheezed, his face pale. "The bag." "Helena, the bag in the pantry." She looked toward the pantry. Sitting on the floor was the heavy leather duffel bag Arthur had packed days ago. It contained $2 million in cash and bearer bonds. Their ticket to a new life, their escape from the shadows of London and the grit of São Paulo. The fire, sparked by a ruptured gas line in the kitchen, was already beginning to lick at the wooden beams of the ceiling. The heat was becoming an entity of its own, a roaring beast that threatened to consume everything. Helena looked at the bag, then at Arthur. He was losing blood fast, his eyes struggling to focus on her. Outside, she could hear the heavy boots of more men approaching, their voices shouting commands in English and Portuguese. If she took the bag, she wouldn't be able to carry Arthur. He was a large man, and even with her adrenaline dragging him through the steep, muddy gully, would require both of her hands and every bit of her stamina. If she stayed to save the money, he would die here, either by a bullet or by the flames. She didn't hesitate for more than a second. The money was just paper and ink. It was the weight that had kept him chained to his past. "To hell with the money," she whispered. She grabbed him by his good arm, draping it over her shoulders. She hissed in pain as the weight of him strained her muscles, but she didn't let go. She dragged him out the back door, the heat of the fire searing the back of her neck. Behind them, the pantry vanished in a roar of orange flame, the millions of dollars turning into blackened ash in an instant. They tumbled into the tall grass of the orchard, the mist providing a thin veil of protection. Helena moved with a feral desperation, her boots slipping on the wet clay as she pulled Arthur toward the stone wall. Every movement was agony. She could feel the hot wetness of his blood soaking into her own clothes, a grim bond between them. You left it," Arthur muttered, his voice fading. "I have everything I need right here," she replied, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They reached the gully, a shallow trench carved by years of tropical rain. She eased him down into the mud, shielding his body with her own, as a group of armed men ran past the stone wall just 3 yards away. She held her breath, her heart drumming so loudly she feared they would hear it. She pressed her face against Arthur's neck, feeling the weak but steady throb of his pulse. In that moment, amidst the mud and the smell of burning cedar, she felt a fierce, protective love that terrified her more than the men with guns. The villa was a towering inferno now, a beacon of destruction against the morning sky. The attackers, realizing the prize they sought was likely incinerated or lost in the chaos, began to retreat toward their vehicles as the sound of distant sirens began to wail. The local police, usually slow to respond to the rural areas, had been alerted by the sheer scale of the noise. Helena waited until the sound of the engines faded into the distance. She looked down at Arthur. He had drifted into unconsciousness, his face ghostly white. She knew she couldn't stay here. Julian would realize they weren't in the rubble soon enough. She looked toward the horizon, toward the winding road that led back to the sprawling, chaotic heart of São Paulo. They were broke, they were bleeding, and they were hunted. But as she began to tear her own shirt to tie a tourniquet around Arthur's shoulder, her eyes were cold and clear. Arthur had taught her how to fight, but she had always known how to survive. She reached into his pocket and found his spare burner phone, the one he had told her never to use unless the world was ending. She dialed a number she had memorized from the ledger she had found weeks ago, a number that didn't belong to a friend, but to a very dangerous enemy of Julian's. As the rain began to fall again, washing the soot from her face, Helena realized the roles had shifted. She was no longer the girl looking for a dry corner to sleep in. She was the only thing standing between Arthur and the grave, and she was about to take the fight back to the city that had tried to break her. But first, she had to get him to a doctor who didn't ask questions, and she knew exactly where to find one in the labyrinth of the city center. She just had to hope Arthur's heart was strong enough to make the journey. In the first week of April of last year, the air in the center of São Paulo was thick with the scent of exhaust fumes and the humidity that always preceded a storm. It was a far cry from the filtered, lavender-scented atmosphere of the penthouse in Jardins. This apartment was a single room in a crumbling building in the República district, where the elevator had been broken since 1998, and the wallpaper peeled like sunburned skin. Helena sat at a scarred wooden table, the blue light of a laptop illuminating her face. She was no longer the trembling girl who had begged for a place to sleep. She was a woman who had seen the world burn and decided to build something from the ashes. On the narrow bed, Arthur shifted, a hiss of pain escaping his teeth. His shoulder was wrapped in thick bandages, the white gauze stark against his tanned skin. The bullet had passed through, but the infection had been a stubborn enemy. For 3 days, Helena had bathed him in cool water, whispered to him in the dark, and forced him to swallow bitter antibiotics she had purchased from a chemist who didn't ask questions. "So you shouldn't be sitting up," Helena said without looking away from the screen. Her voice was steady, anchored by a new kind of authority. "I'm tired of staring at the ceiling, Helena," Arthur rasped. He sat up slowly, his muscles corded and tense. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the transformation. She wore a simple black tank top and jeans, her hair pulled back in a practical knot. The expensive jewelry he had bought her was gone, sold to fund their disappearance, but she had never looked more regal. "What are you doing?" "I'm finishing what Julian started," she replied. Her fingers danced across the keys. You taught me that in your world, information is more lethal than lead. Julian thinks he's won because he burned the villa and took the territory. He thinks we're dead or hiding in a gutter. Arthur leaned back against the headboard, his eyes narrowing. The recording from the Sambadrome, you still have it? I have everything, she said, not just his threats against us. I spent the last 4 hours digging through the encrypted folders you showed me how to access. I found the discrepancies in the London ledgers. Julian wasn't just coming for your Brazilian operations, Arthur. He's been skimming from the London syndicate for 3 years. He's been redirecting 5% of the North End port profits into a private account in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't just a rival, he was a thief stealing from his own masters. The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur knew better than anyone what the men in London did to thieves. The organization they called the Firm did not believe in second chances or legal proceedings. They believed in making examples. If you send that, Arthur whispered, his voice a mix of admiration and dread, there is no going back. You are engaging with monsters, Helena. Monsters who will remember your digital footprint. Helena stood up and walked over to the bed. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the heat from Arthur's body radiating toward her. She reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of his jaw, tracing the rough stubble there. The touch was electric, a silent communication of everything they had endured since that rainy Tuesday in October. I've lived in the shadows my whole life, Arthur, she said softly, her eyes locked onto his steel-blue gaze. I was a ghost in your kitchen. I can be a ghost in theirs, but I won't let him hunt us anymore. I'm tired of running. Arthur reached out with his good arm, pulling her closer. The proximity was intoxicating. The scent of her skin, a mix of soap and fierce determination, overwhelming the stale air of the room. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath hitching. You were supposed to just clean and cook, Helena. You were supposed to be the one thing in my life that wasn't stained by this blood. I'm cleaning your life, Arthur, she whispered against his lips. I'm taking out the trash. She kissed him then, a desperate, searing contact that tasted of salt and survival. It wasn't the tentative kiss of the penthouse, it was the seal of a pact made in the trenches. His hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her into the heat of his embrace, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind her ear. For a few minutes the world outside, the sirens, the shouting, the threat of Julian, did not exist. There was only the two of them, two broken souls who had found a strange, violent harmony. When they finally broke apart, Helena's eyes were bright. She returned to the laptop. With a single, decisive click, she sent a massive, encrypted file to a series of untraceable addresses in the East End of London. The file contained the audio of Julian bragging about his new empire at the Sambadrome, the ledger evidence of his theft, and the exact coordinates of the safe house where Julian was currently celebrating his perceived victory. It's done, she said. The next 48 hours were a blur of tension. They didn't leave the room. They ate bread and fruit, spoke in low voices, and waited. Arthur watched the news on a small, flickering television. On the second night, a short report appeared on a local channel. A fire had broken out at a luxury warehouse near the port of Santos. 3 men had been found dead, executed with professional precision. The police described it as a settling of accounts between foreign elements. Helena watched the screen, her expression unreadable. She felt no guilt, only a cold sense of relief. Julian was gone, not because they had killed him, but because he had been consumed by the very darkness he served. He's gone, Arthur said, his voice hollow. He looked at his hands, the hands that had done so much damage over the years. I'm a dead man now, Helena. To London, to Brazil, to everyone. I have nothing left. You have me, she reminded him, moving to the small window that overlooked the city. And you have the offshore accounts, the ones Julian didn't know about. We have enough to start over. Not as a king and a servant, but as whoever we want to be. Arthur stood up, moving more easily now as his strength returned. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They looked out at the sprawling neon sea of São Paulo. You saved me, he murmured. A man like me doesn't get saved, yet here I am. We saved each other, she corrected. But as the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, a realization settled over them. While Julian was gone, the power vacuum he left behind was a dangerous thing. Arthur's death had to be permanent, and their disappearance had to be absolute. Helena knew that the hardest part wasn't the war they had just finished, it was the peace they were about to begin. She turned in his arms, her expression serious. "There's one more thing, Arthur. To make this work, to truly be free, we have to disappear before the firm sends someone to verify the bodies. We need to leave tonight." Arthur nodded, but his eyes drifted to the laptop on the table. "There's a ghost in the machine, Helena. Did you wipe the logs?" She went to answer, her mouth opening to reassure him, when a soft, rhythmic knocking sounded at the door. It wasn't the heavy hand of the local police or the frantic banging of a neighbor. It was 3 slow, deliberate raps, the sound of a professional. Arthur's hand immediately went to the small handgun tucked into the waistband of his jeans, his face turning into a mask of ice. Helena felt a chill run down her spine. They were supposed to be invisible. They were supposed to be safe. As the handle of the door began to turn, Helena realized that while they had cleaned the house, they hadn't yet locked the door to the past. On a quiet Sunday in April of last year, the air in the countryside of Minas Gerais carried the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The rainy season had finally relented, leaving behind a lush, emerald landscape that felt worlds away from the suffocating concrete and glass of São Paulo. At the edge of a sprawling estate, tucked behind thick stone walls and guarded by a silent, loyal staff, the world believed Arthur was a ghost. To the London syndicate, he was a fallen soldier, a casualty of Julian's ambition. To the Brazilian authorities, he was a name on a list of disappeared foreign nationals. But to Helena, he was the man sitting on the wide veranda, his shoulder still stiff from a bullet wound that had nearly claimed his life in March. Helena stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet silent against the polished dark wood. She was no longer the waif-like creature who had crawled into a penthouse kitchen seeking a dry corner to die in. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk that caught the afternoon light, her hair thick and healthy, cascading down her back. In her hand, she carried a silver tray with 2 glasses of wine and a small leather-bound portfolio. Arthur looked up as she approached. The steel blue of his eyes had softened, the predatory sharpness replaced by a weary, profound peace. He watched her move with the grace of a woman who finally knew she was safe. When she set the tray down, he reached out, his fingers grazing the skin of her wrist. The touch was light, but the electricity between them remained as potent as the night they had first kissed against the glass of the high-rise. "The reports came in this morning," Helena said, her voice steady and melodious. "Julian's accounts in the Cayman Islands were frozen 48 hours ago. The London board didn't just remove him from the operation, they ensured he would never be a threat to anyone again. It was clean, Arthur. No loose ends." Arthur leaned back, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "You did what 20 years of my own ruthlessness couldn't do, Helena. You fought them with their own greed. I spent my life thinking the loudest gun in the room held the power. I was wrong. It's the person who knows where the silence is kept." He reached for the leather portfolio she had brought out. Inside were the deeds to their new properties, the digital keys to offshore accounts, and the legal frameworks for a dozen legitimate businesses that would sustain them for 3 lifetimes. He didn't just look at the numbers, he looked at the name listed as the primary beneficiary on every single document. It was her name. "I told you once that I would give you a home," Arthur whispered, pulling her toward him. Helena sank into his lap, mindful of his injured shoulder. She wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the steady thrum of his heart against her chest. The physical proximity was a comfort they had earned through blood and fire. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of her skin, a mix of expensive soap and the wild, free air of the hills. "You gave me more than a home," Helena replied, her fingers tracing the jagged line of the scar on his jaw. "You gave me a reason to stop running. But you're handing me everything, Arthur. These assets, the control. You're giving me the keys to your entire empire." "It isn't an empire anymore," he corrected, his voice muffled against her skin. "It's a foundation. I don't want the weight of it. I've spent 38 years carrying the sins of other men. Let me be the ghost, Helena. You be the architect. You saved my life when you dragged me out of that burning villa, leaving millions of dollars to turn to ash. You chose a man over a fortune. This is my way of telling you that I choose you over the world." The sensuality of the moment wasn't found in a hurried embrace, but in the slow, deliberate way he pressed his forehead against hers. It was a surrender. The man who had once raised a silenced pistol at her was now placing his entire future in her hands. Helena felt the weight of it, not as a burden but as a crown. She had promised him on that rainy night in October that she could clean and cook. She had cleaned the filth from his past and cooked a future that tasted of redemption. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, they sat in a silence that was no longer heavy with secrets. The moral dilemma that had once haunted Helena, the fear of becoming a villain by association, had transformed into a complex understanding of survival. Justice, she realized, wasn't always found in a courtroom or through the hands of the law. Sometimes justice was two broken people finding a way to build a fortress out of the wreckage of their lives. Arthur's hand moved to the small of her back, pulling her closer as the evening chill began to settle. He kissed her then, a long, deep connection that tasted of wine and the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. There was no more London syndicate, no more Julian, and no more fear of the shadows. They were the masters of their own isolation. "Are you happy?" he asked against her lips. Helena looked out over the lush valley, thinking of the girl who had owned nothing but a threadbare backpack and the desperation in her lungs. She thought of her father's debts, the cold nights on the streets of the Jardins, and the blood she had scrubbed from Arthur's silk shirts. All of it had been a path leading to this porch, to this man, and to this power. "I am more than happy," she whispered. "I am settled." The consequences of their actions were written in the scars they carried and the names they had discarded, but the resilience of the human spirit had proven more durable than any empire built on fear. Arthur had lost his shadow, and Helena had lost her invisibility. Together they had stepped into the light of a new reality, one where the ghost in the kitchen had become the queen of the estate. As the first stars appeared over the Brazilian highlands, the two survivors stood together, looking out at a world that no longer had a hold on them. They had navigated the labyrinth of greed and violence, emerging not as victims, but as the authors of their own final chapter. The house was clean, the table was set, and for the first time in either of their lives they were finally irrevocably home.